The Kute Siches, Chelek Yud Zayin, Tazria Aleph. The Sicha is on the pasuk of Ubayoy Mashmini Imel B'Sar Lose, which is in this week's parsha, the mitzvah of a bris on the 8th day, and will explore the idea that a bris must take place during the day and not at night. Even a postponed bris must be during the day, even if it's not on the 8th day, it's still on just 2 weeks later, it still has to be during the daytime and not at night. And we're going to ask the question, why by the night of the Karban Pesach in Mitzrayim did many Yidden have a bris milah even though it was night? On the side, we're going to explore whether the first Pesach in Mitzrayim, the Yidden were obligated to observe Pesach, to not do malacha. And we're going to end with the explanation al pi Chassidus, what was unique about that night and how it contributed to the dilug ukfitza, to the Pesach, to the going out of our limitations that ultimately defined Yitzias Mitzrayim. So let's do this inside. The pasuk in our parsha which says that on the 8th day a person needs to be given a bris, to circumcise his foreskin. So the Chazal tell us both in the Medrash Sifra, in the Teres Kehanim, in Gemara, it says it has to be on the 8th day, it has to be during the daytime and not at night. When leidem kommt aus, as der Din in ein Mal in Balayla is nischadisch geworden erst noch Matan Teira, und far Matan Teira hat man die Hila gemerkt sein echt Balayla, which would teach us, which would imply that this bedin, that Mila has to be at night, is something that we learn after Matan Teira. However, before Matan Teira, it may have been permissible to do a bris at night. The Gemara in Shabbos learns this din from a different pasuk. As we learned this up from Uben Shmein As Yomim V'Gemer B'Shteit in Parshas Lech Lecha. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, learns that from the fact that it says Uben Shmein As Yomim Yimer Lechem Kol Zochel D'Retzechem, it says Yomim, days. This teaches us that a bris has to be during the day. In other words, it's learned in Parshas Lech Lecha, which is before Matan Teira. And Teisves teaches that the main limud, the primary learning, is from this pasuk in Lech Lecha. And in Parshas Tazria is only reinforcing what was already learned in Parshas Lech Lecha. Is the Sabra b'Negei Milah Bizmana? It would only be relevant to a bris that was done in the right time, on the 8th day. A bris is supposed to be done on the 8th day. If it's being done on the 8th day, it can't be done the night before because it's not yet the 8th day. It can't be done the night after because it's not the 8th day anymore. So therefore, it has to be by day. Aber as Mila Shalei Bizmana Muzayim Bayim. How do I know that a bris that had to be postponed, let's say for medical reasons, a bris that had to be postponed is happening 2 weeks later? Does it have to be during the day, or can it be even at nighttime? So lernt men up from them vav ubayei mashmini gemen unzer parsha. That both opinions, even the opinion that learns that Mila by Yoim is learned from Parshas Lech Lecha, when it's a Mila shaloi bizmana, a postponed bris, this is learned from the vav of ubayei mashmini in our pasuk, in our parsha. V'tesis is just mevair, as is explained in Tesis, which means that it's only after Matan Teira that we learn that a bris shaloi bizmana, a postponed bris, has to be during the daytime and not at night. Which would imply that before Matan Teira, if the bris was not bizman, it's possible that it would be permitted to be even at night. And in Seif Beis, we're going to elaborate on this idea by telling us an interesting medrash, a beautiful medrash about the bris of the Yidden on the eve of Pesach in Mitzrayim. So we'll preface what it says in the medrash. When the Yidden were still in Mitzrayim, many of the Yidden did not accept upon themselves to be circumcised. Make the Karban Pesach. And once Moshe made the Karban Pesach, the Eibishter commanded the wind from all the four corners of the world to blow very strongly into the world, into Mitzrayim. And what the winds did is they spread the aroma of the carbon Pesach to all the Yidden, and the Yidden smelled the carbon Pesach, and they wanted to take part in it. Niskansu kol Yisrael etzel Moshe. So they came to Moshe Rabbeinu, Amrulai, they said to him, B'bakasha mimcha, please, ha'achileinu mipischacha, feed us from your carbon Pesach. It smells so wonderful. It smells so delicious. We want to have a piece. Could we have a piece? So Moshe tells them, first he tells them some of the other psukim with regards to a bris, and then he tells them with regards to carbon Pesach, and then he tells them that if a person is uncircumcised, they can't eat the carbon Pesach. So he said to them, if you're not circumcised, then you can't eat the carbon Pesach. It's one of the prerequisites to a carbon Pesach, that the person who's eating it, or really the person who's part of the chabura, but at least the person who's eating it has to be circumcised. Miyad nosnu atzman umalu v'chulu. So immediately they went and they circumcised. So they right away they didn't circumcise themselves, so that way they should be able to take part in the korban of Pesach of Moshe Rabbeinu. From the Medrash Kumtois. So from this Medrash we deduce, as Eden am sich mal given beleil Pesach, that the Yidden had a bris on the night of Pesach. Nochmer from Medrash ubefrat and Shira Shirim Rabbah, from the Medrash, especially Shira Shirim Rabbah, which is another Medrash that talks about the same story of the winds encouraging the Yidden to come to the carbon Pesach, which previously was from Shmois Rabbah, and it's also in Shira Shirim Rabbah, is mashma, but from this Medrash and Shira Shirim Rabbah, it seems to imply as Moshe Rabbeinu had bechlal nit ibrig gegeben zu Yidden dem Tzivoy, v'chol orel leyechol, by the Moshe never even told them this command, that an oralist, uncircumcised person cannot partake in the carbon Pesach, bis by Nacht, until that night, when Eden seine gekommen betten by Moshe nachlenu mipischacha. In other words, maybe it may have been possible that Moshe told it to them earlier and then had to tell it to them again. From the Medrash Shira Shirim Rabbah, it seems that Moshe had never told them this necessity to circumcise themselves until that night. So it comes out that the Yidden had a bris. Those Yidden that had not yet been circumcised themselves on the night of Pesach in order to partake in the carbon Pesach. Isn't it move on? And now we have a question. Although it might be true that it was permissible to be circumcised because before Matan Torah, if it was a milah, these are adults. So clearly it wasn't being done on the 8th day. It's allowed to be done even at night. As far as the Chabara Azbara, it still demands an explanation. At least on the deeper level. Since the fact that many of the Yidden circumcised themselves not on their own initiative, but because the Eibishter ordained that there should be winds, that should encourage them to want the carbon Pesach. And Moshe could tell them to have a breeze. The wind or the aroma caused that they should want to eat from Moshe's carbon Pesach. Hashem could have done the same trick or a similar trick before dark. And then Moshe would command the Yidden that an uncircumcised person cannot eat the carbon Pesach. And then they would have had a bris by day. In other words, even though we said in Sif Aleph that before Matan Torah it was okay to have a milah shleibas mana at night, but we know that the proper thing to do, the better thing to do, is for the bris to be by day. So Mele, if it was on their own thing, so whenever they got excited about it, fine. But if it's being organized, arranged by the Eibishter, by making a bris, by making a wind, it's going to inspire them, encourage them, awaken them. Do it a little earlier. Do it a little earlier. And that way it'll be during the daytime, and the Yidden's bris will have happened by day. So that's our question. Why did the Eibishter not arrange that the bris of the Yidden should be by daytime? Now, in Seif Gimel and Daled, we're going to bring a Yefei Tayar, which is a Pirush on the Medrash, that's going to say that Taka, this whole story happened before Chashecha, before dark. And the Rebbe is going to refute it and say, for both reasons that the Yefei Tayar brings, they're both invalid, and it's clear that the bris, that the carbon Pesach and the bris was done at night. The Yefei Tayar vil Zagin, the Yefei Tayar wants to say, It's possible that this was before dark. It brings two compelling proofs for this. Number one, he says, after dark it was Yom Tiv. And a milah shalei bismana is not deicha Yom Tiv. A milah bismana is deicha Shabbos, deicha Yom Tiv. You do it on the 8th day, regardless of what day it is. But if the milah is shalei bismana, then you're not allowed to, for various reasons, you're not allowed to make a bris on Yom Tiv, and therefore you push the bris off. So that's one hechrich. It was Yom Tiv. You can't make a bris on Yom Tiv. And the second hechrich is that milah is not. You can't do milah at night, which is the discussion that we're having. The Yifei Tayar comes to the conclusion that because you can't do a bris at night, this must have happened before dark. We can't follow what the Yifei Tayar says. Weil von dem Sipur wir gebrachten Shir Hashirim Rabbi from Posik Ad Shah Melech b'Mesibay. The Shir Hashirim Rabbi brings the Posik on, brings this medrash, the story on the Posik Ad Shah Melech b'Mesibay. The king was gathering at his table. And according to that medrash, this king is Moshe Rabbeinu, and the gathering at the table is referring to his Karban Pesach. He's klor asigven balayla. So it's clear that this happened at night when Moshe was actually ready to eat his Karban Pesach. Dort steht beferish. Adas is vorgekommen ad shamelach b'mesiboy. That this happened at Moshe v'Yisrael misubin v'oichlin peschein b'Mitzrayim. It happened when Moshe and the Yidden were gathered around their tables to eat their Karban Pesach in Mitzrayim. Unachilas Pesach is doch balayla hazeh. The Karban Pesach for sure was at night. Not before dark. So clearly, since this is happening during the night when you're eating the Karban Pesach, clearly this happened at night. And the two proofs that the Yifei Tayar brings, number one, that Milah Shalei Bismana is not Yom Tiv, and Beis Ein Milah B'Layla, that you can't do Milah at night, both of these are not compelling. Aleph, we're going to go backwards here. The Yifei Tayar brings first the fact that it was Yom Tiv, and second the fact that that you can't do a bris at night. So the first thing that Rabbi brings here, Aleph, is about the milah at night. Because here is the din as a milah balayla by shalei bismana. The din that you can't have a bris at night by a milah shalei bismana was only introduced after Matan Torah. This is before Matan Torah. So therefore, there's no proof from here that a milah balayla, because at this point you could have a milah balayla. Beis, with regards to the other proof that the Yifei Tayar brings, that it was Yom Tiv and you can't do a bris on Yom Tiv. So the Rebbe is going to say two things. First, from here till the end of Seif Gimel, and second in Seif Dalet. The first half is going to say that in Mitzrayim they did not observe Yom Tiv. The fact that we don't do Malacha on Yom Tiv did not start that year when the Yidden were still in Mitzrayim. And it's going to explain. We do not find the fact that first Pesach in Mitzrayim there was an Isser Malacha. The pasuk that says on the first day of Pesach and on the 7th day of Pesach as Mikra Kodesh is a holy day, and you're not allowed to do Malacha. State in Parshas Boy, even though it's written in Parshas Boy, and Boy is before Matan Torah. Boy is that time when the Yidden are in Mitzrayim. Muz benaber zogin as their pasuk retzich nit wegen Pesach Mitzrayim. We must say that is not talking about Pesach Mitzrayim. Varum Pesach Mitzrayim elanoigim echad. Pesach Mitzrayim was only a one-day thing because the next day they were out. They were out of Mitzrayim. Und in the pasuk steht doch ubayei mashvi mikra kodesh v'geimer. And the pasuk is talking about the 7th day. So if there's no 7th day, then there's no first day. Meaning to say, just like the pasuk is talking about a time when you can have a first day and a 7th day, and there was no 7th day Mitzrayim. So clearly that pasuk is not talking about Pesach Mitzrayim. It's talking about later years. And therefore the Isser Malacha begins later on, and there was no Isser Malacha on that Pesach, and therefore there's no Isser for Bris. In the brackets, in the next two paragraphs, he's going to explain, maybe he's going to try to answer and then refute the answer that maybe there's two parts to the pasuk, and at least the Bayem Rishon part was kept. And he's going to say that can't be for three reasons. And you can't answer. The pasuk is referring to two independent dinim that are not connected one to another. The first half of the pasuk is talking about the first day, which was applicable to Pesach Mitzrayim. And the second pasuk is on the 7th day, which was only applicable later on in the future generations. You can't say that. Vile. Because three explanations, three reasons. Aleph, number one, in Pasuk state, that no malacha should be done on them, on those days in the plural. Das heißt, dass der Isser Malacha von Yom HaRishon und von Yom HaShvi werden beide Nichel in selben Sivoy. Bahem, there's one pasuk, there's one part of the pasuk that says no malacha should be done on those days, namely the first and the seventh. The pasuk groups them together. Base. The second point of why you can't separate these two dinim. I've called malacha le'yasavim state in Mechilte. On this pasuk, the Mechilte says, "Ein li el yom tov ha'achrin shu'asher b'siyas malacha." So from this pasuk, I know that Shvi shel Pesach, the last day of Yom Tov, is asher b'siyas malacha. Yom Tov harishon minayin. How do I know also the first day? So from kol malacha le'yasavim, the Medrash understands, the Mechilte understands that it's referring to Shvi shel Pesach. Since it also says by Yom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh, we know that it would apply also to the first day of Yom Tov. So this would imply that based on the Mechiltas, that Ikir Yisr state of Yom HaShvi. Now, durch them, land ben apech by Yom HaRishon. With the main Yisr, the primary Yisr is by Yom HaShvi. And from this we can deduce that also by Yom HaRishon is also Asa b'Malacha. When we bought the Pesach Mitzrayim, it did give them the Ikar Yisr B'Yom HaShvi, and since by Pesach Mitzrayim the primary Yisr didn't exist, there was no seventh day of Yom Tov. Versteht man b'meila as eich der Yisr Noisef by Yom HaRishon ratzich nit like a Pesach Mitzrayim. So the additional Yisr of the first day, which is something that's added on to the seventh day, would also not apply. If the primary doesn't apply, then the secondary for sure doesn't apply. So based on the Mechilta, you can't learn by Yom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh that it means that Yisr Malacha if you don't have the Yom HaShvi Mikra Kodesh. And Gimel, the third point, but Pesach Mitzrayim is B'chlal not given Yom HaRishon. Yom HaRishon means the first day. The first means the second and the third, or more. You can't call it Yom HaRishon nor Yom Echad. You would call it the day, the one day of Yom Tov. But you're saying by Yom HaRishon, you're already telling me that there's more days to Yom Tov, which didn't exist by Pesach Mitzrayim. So therefore, the Isser of Kol Malacha Le'yaseh B'Hem does not apply to this Pesach Mitzrayim, and therefore they could have had a bris at night. So the fact that the Yefei Torah says that it was during the day, because Ein Molin B'Yontiv, because Ein Molin B'Yontiv doesn't apply that year, because that year there was no Yisr Malach. Siv Dalet. In Siv Dalet is going to address the Ran. The Ran says, the lashon over there is the Pesach Mitzrayim Lo Noag Ela Laila V'Yom. So the Ran holds that even that year there was an Isser Malacha on the first day of Pesach. So maybe, at least according to the Ran, that this is a proof that the bris of the Yidden happened during the daytime earlier, because you can't do because it was Yontif and you can't do a bris. So here he's going to learn a Geschmack Pshetel that the bris could have still been at night, even though it was Yontiv, and Yontiv is also b'malacha. I feel the later day from that, as a Pesach Mitzrayim is yet given an Isser Malacha, even according to the day of that in Pesach Mitzrayim there wasn't Isser Malacha. Kenman for them in the Kashaf and that we could still answer the question. V is Milish Levis Manadich Yontiv, how they were able to do a bris on Yontiv. Ubahaktim Adiyuk in Loshna Medrash and Shira Shinim Rabba. By first prefacing a point that could be made in the Medrash. Over there it says, it brings the pasuk from Shir Hashirim that they were all well learned in battle, holding their swords with their swords on their waists, on their hips. So the Medrash says on this pasuk that when Moshe told them that they have to have a bris in order to eat the Korban Pesach, each person took his sword from his waist, and circumcised himself. That's what the Medrash says. That's how eager they were to eat the Korban Pesach, that they withdrew the sword from their belt and they circumcised themselves on the spot. So we have two questions on this. Aleph, the Rikir is as they why mention what tool they used? Why they say, and just say immediately they circumcised themselves right away. Why is it relevant that they used the sword? Vos is the adgasha beis, vos is the adgasha char boy zayin cherev. Why is there an emphasis that each person took their own sword? L'mainav community der cherev is zayin other from nandish. Who cares? Why is it relevant if it was his own sword or someone else's sword? The way the Medrash says, not al charboy al yirech, each person took their own sword. Why does it have to be a sword? And why is it relevant that it was a sword? And why is it relevant that it was each person took their own sword? Nor der mitver for the Abraham and Shaila, but this answers the above mentioned question. When is Mila Malacha Asura B'Yamtiv? When is Mila forbidden on Yamtiv? When sie wird getan kedarka. If she is done in the regular way, Be'izmel, with a small knife, which is specifically used for brisn, for circumcisions. Aber Mila b'cherev is Malacha Shalei kedarka, unazam Malacha is mutter b'deiraisa. But if he used the sword, which is an unusual way to do the malacha, then because it's shalei kedarka, because it's unusual, at least mid-deiraisa, it would be mutter. The Rabbi is the Medrash on their pasuk was bringt. Madgish as matzach mal given becherev. This is why the Medrash and the pasuk upon which the Medrash is based emphasizes the fact that it was a sword to tell us that even if it was yontiv, and the yamtiv mila is aser, in this case they use the sword, which is shalei kedarka, and therefore permissible. Then it's obrigistan and cherev stam, and to take this a step further, had it just said cherev stam, voltman noch alles gekent meinen as der retzich wegen a cherev mit welchen mi sich mal. If it would have just said each person took a sword, then you would have said maybe it's referring to a sword that is used specifically for a bris, and then it's kedarka. Wie steht in the pasuk by Yeshua, say lecha charbeis tzurim v'shuv melis b'nei Yisrael shenis, make for yourself charbeis tzurim, a kind of sword, which Rashi teaches actually, at least Izmelain, which is Izemel, which is a mila knife, but it's called a charbeis. It's referred to as a sword. The Rebbe is the pasuk mad is charboy, and therefore the pasuk says that each person took his own sword. Zayin cherev, the cherev from Mulum de Melchama, the sword of the warriors. Versus doch nit ken cherev mit welchem izmal, which if it's there for war, it's obviously not a cherev for a bris. So even if you're going to say that you can't do a milah on yontif, that would be kedarka with an izmal. If you're using a cherev, a sword that's usually used for battle, and you're using it for a bris, it's shalei kedarka, and it's mutter bismidayraisa, it's mutter on yontif, and therefore even if it was a night, they could have still done the bris. And this refutes the approach of the Yifei Toyar, which wanted to say that this whole medrash, the story, happened during the daytime because ein milah b'yamtiv or ein molim balayla. So first of all, ein molim balayla doesn't apply because it was before Matan Torah and it was a milah shalei bismana. And ein molim b'yamtiv doesn't apply either because you follow the day that year b'chlal there was no Isser Melacha, and even if you follow the day of the Ran, that there was an Isser Melacha, but nevertheless this Melacha was done shalei kedarka, and therefore it wouldn't have been a problem. So now we're going to go back to our original question. So if we're not following the Yifei Tayar, comes out that the bris of the Yidden was actually during the nighttime. So then this brings us back to square one, to our original question. Since this was coordinated, so to speak, by the Eibishter, because of the winds that blew and brought about the smell of the Korban Pesach that got the Yidden to do a bris. So the question is, why couldn't the Eibishter play this whole game? Shouldn't call it a game, but this whole event. Why couldn't it happen before dark? And that way the Yidden would have the bris before, when it was still daytime, and the bris would be by yom, which is certainly better, seemingly, than a bris being by night. Unless, as we're going to see in Sifei and Weiter, that there was dafka and inyan in that bris being at night. That's the how we're going to make a 180-degree turn here, and we're going to discover that bris had a dafka be at night. And that's what he's going to start explaining in Sifei. We're going to understand this by first introducing another reason, another explanation, which some of the Achrayim bring to answer the question, how is it possible that or why did the Yidden have a bris at night? So these Achrayim say, as the Nacht when Yitzias Mitzrayim is given, via steht in Zayar, in an Eifen from Laila Kayem Yoyer, that night, the night of the going, right, the night prior to going out of Mitzrayim, the night of the Korban Pesach, The night illuminated like was illuminated like the day. It was bright as day. And therefore the night had a din of day. And therefore you could have a bris that night, you could have a bris even at night. Because the night was a day. Frekman have done the question on this is if it had the din of a day, the mitzvahs was then verbunden mit Laila. How did the Yidden fulfill the mitzvahs that need to be done at night? Achilas Pesach, matzah, morer, b'chulu, these things, eating the korban Pesach, eating matzah, eating morer, which had to be done at night. He says, "Ichlos abasar b'layla hazeh," eat it at night. So if it's the night, then how do you do a bris? If it's the day, how do you do the other mitzvahs? Muzman sagen. So therefore, we must say, as the din von yom the din, the fact that night was considered a day, is as only applied to the mitzvah of milah. Aber nicht legabe the mitzvahs anal, but not with regard to the other mitzvahs of the korban Pesach. Und der Chelek is verstandig with pastors, and obviously it's understood very obviously as we're not seeing mefedish of them. With regards to the other things, ichlos abasar balayla gamer masnechem chagurim, eat it at this night. So clearly that it wasn't about darkness and light. This was a time that they were supposed to eat it, regardless if it was dark or light. That was the mitzvah of that korban Pesach. Eat it in this night. But with regards to the mitzvah of milah, it was still considered a day, and because of that, the bris was allowed to be that night because the Laila Kayem Yoy. That's the explanation that the Achreinim give al pi nigel the Torah. The question is going to be al pi chassidus, al pi pnimi yanim. How do we explain that with regards to bris, it was considered a day, and why dafke do a bris even if it was day? Why not? Why do it by day? By a night that's a day, and not by a day that's a day. So in Sivav, we're going to go into the Pnimi Sanyanim. Der Bier b'Pnimi Sanyanim mitvos is mitzvah mila anders. Was nor legabe ir is the nach when b'chinas b'layla kayem yoyer. How do we explain al Pnimi Sanyanim why specifically with regards to the mitzvah of mila was the night considered like the day? So here's the thing. The inyan von Yetzias Mitzrayim is given in ganzen bederach von Pesach Diluk. The whole idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim was the idea of Pesach, of jumping, of going out of the normal order of the day. Hecher from Medida v'Agbala from Teva, going out of the constraints of nature. From Alpi Teva, when the Yidden came from Mitzrayim, naturally speaking, the Yidden could not have gone out of Mitzrayim. Sai Begasmi is both on a physical level. That even one servant could not escape from Mitzrayim. Und sei beruchni is also on a more ruchnistic levels. And Eden given muska in them teshare tumarachman stand. The Eden were immersed in 49 levels, 49 gates of impurity, and therefore they were not on a spiritual level that was ready to take them out of Mitzrayim. And therefore, the only way to get them out of Mitzrayim was to break nature, the nature of Gashmis and the nature of Ruchnius, and take them out of Mitzrayim. How do you break the constraints of nature? Down here, meaning gvulim. Von ganz say that by breaking or nullifying the constraints, the meitzarim, which are the gvulim, the borders, the structure. Von ganz Seder Ishtalshalos, from the entire Seder Ishtalshalos. In other words, this world on down here is the very end of Seder Ishtalshalos. But before this world, there are other Elames and other levels going back all the way to Atzilus. And how do you break the order? How do you break the Medidus V'Agbalus of Teva here? By breaking the Medidus V'Agbalus, the constraints of the entire Seder Ishtalshalos. Was does that? Durch dem, was es ist mehr an was is the Gamri Hecher from Kol Medida V'Agbala from Kol Seder Ishtalshalos, by bringing down a light that shines, that's coming from a place that's beyond Seder Ishtalshalos, and therefore it overwhelms Seder Ishtalshalos, it breaks its structure, it breaks its Medidas V'Agbalas, and by that, and consequently, this world, which is the very end of Seder Ishtalshalos, the lowest level, also loses its Medidas V'Agbalas and can experience a Pesach. Yetzias Mitzrayim. Wie bald as alle in Yonim müssen kommen durch Teira, since everything comes from Teira, darfen sie früher sein bei Teira. So since everything originates from Torah, so every experience has to start in Torah. Muz eich der Inyan. Hamshacha sa'er shalamayla meishtalshalos. G'dei zum mevatel sein, die medidis von Seder eishtalshalos für ihr sein in Torah. So this whole also has to go through Torah in order to bring down a light that's higher than Seder eishtalshalos. In order to break the order, the nature of Seder eishtalshalos, this has to go through Torah. In Torah wird nimshich von a hecher in art wie Torah is mitzad atzme kiviyachol hecher von die medidis von Torah. That in Torah you draw down something that is coming from a place that's higher than Torah, higher than the constraints of Torah. And once you are able to bring into Torah something that's higher than Torah, then that could impact Seder Hayishtalshelus, that a light will come from higher from Seder Hayishtalshelus and break the nature of Seder Hayishtalshelus, and thus break the nature of this world, and then there could be a Yitzias Mitzrayim. Der Riber hat Moshe, der Rebbe gemacht, dass Moshe Rabbeinu soll übergeben dem Zivui. Now this will explain to us why Moshe Rabbeinu was told to deliver, to convey this tzivui, this command of an uncircumcised person not being allowed to eat the carbon Pesach. Specifically after it got dark, so that the milah of the Yidden should come out at night. Not the way it would be after Matan Torah, according to the rules, the nature of Torah, that milah has to be during the day. Here we had to break the rules of Torah, so to speak, and have a milah at night. Now, halachically, it wasn't a problem because Laila Kayem Yoyer. But it still was a night, it still was on the clock, it was still night. So we were breaking the medida of Torah in order to break the medida of Seder Hayishtalshelus, in order to break the medida of this world, in order for there to be a Yitzias Mitzrayim, a dilug and a kvitza. If I'm understanding this correctly, this is an incredible vort. What he's telling us over here is that in order for Yitzias Mitzrayim to happen, that we had to go higher than Seder Hayishtalshelus. In order to go higher than Seder Hayishtalshelus, we had to go higher than Torah, and therefore the Eibishter arranged that it should be a bris dafke at night, in a Laila Kayem Yor night, so that we're going higher than Torah in order to break the medida of Torah, in order to break the medida of Seder Hayishtalshelus, in order for there to be a Yitzias Mitzrayim. And we mamshich inside with more Asius. The light that shined in that night was one that was higher than the entire Seder Shalshalus. Even higher than the constraints of Torah. And therefore it was able to break the nature, the rules of Seder Shalshalus. It was a oir that came down in the manner of dilug, in a manner of jumping, in a manner of going out of the normal order. There was able to be Elokus godliness in Mitzrayim vizi is Malaya Gilulim as she is filled with idolatry. But in Seder Ishtalsos, it would be impossible to fuse together a Gili Elokus in a place which is full of Avodah Zarah. Und durch them, but it became possible because there was an oil that came from the Malam Ishtalshlus. Und durch them is this battle going to Medida, and because once we broke the Medida of Seder Ishtalshlus, we broke the Medida of nature in this world. Since in Pesach Dilug, we were able to jump over the normal order of nature, which is given Yitzias Mitzrayim Hebechateva, and it was possible to be Yitzias Mitzrayim, which was totally unnatural. So we now understand the Pnimi Sainyanim, a whole other thing. The fact that the bris was at night, bris of the Yidden was at night, wasn't because they never heard about it until now and it was too late and they had no choice. It was ordained to be dafke at night, so that we go higher than the medida of Torah, so that way we can impact Seder Ishtalshelus, to break the medida v'agbala of Seder Ishtalshelus, so that way we could break the medida v'agbala of Teva in this world, and only then could there be a Yitzias Mitzrayim, only then could we break nature and allow the Yidden out of Mitzrayim, both begashmius and beruchnius. The question that remains to be answered is why bris? If we have to break the medida of Torah, why was the mitzvah of bris milah specifically used to break the medidah of Torah? Why not any other mitzvah? Why couldn't there be another mitzvah or another inyan in Torah that we went higher than Torah and did it in an oifen that's l'mayla medidah v'agbala of Torah, or l'mayla medidah of Torah? And why mitzvah of bris? So that's what he's going to explain in Sif Zayin. Punkt wie muss sein der Inyan Dilug in Torah. Just like there had to be a jump in Torah, meaning to say something to go beyond the ordinances, the constraints of Torah, in order for there to be Tzis Mitzrayim. Azayat gedarf sein euch bei Yidden in Aveda von Dilug, also by the Yidden themselves. They themselves had to serve Hashem in a manner of Dilug, l'mayla me'ishtalshal ba'adam, going higher than their own ishtalshalus, than their own natural order, in order to experience Tzis Mitzrayim. This is why the preparation to Tzis Mitzrayim was the blood of the Karban Pesach and the blood of the Bris Milah. Now, these two mitzvahs from Pesach and Milah, Zayin and Aveda Shel Ma'ala Me'agbala, these two mitzvahs are an Aveda that are higher than Hagbala. Pesach is Miloshen Dilug. Pesach comes from the word to jump, which implies going higher than the normal order of nature. Und Milah is in Yana Bris Olam. Milah is a permanent covenant mit Neibishn, with Hashem. An Ebiker Farbund on Kain Shumagbolis, an eternal bond without any limitations, which implies that this is something that is higher than limitations. So both Karban Pesach, which means kvitza, jumping, which means going out of the limitations, and Milah, which is eternal and permanent, it means beyond limitations, infinite. So therefore, these two mitzvahs, because we want the Yid to go out of their limitations, we have two mitzvahs that are infinite mitzvahs, or mitzvahs with an infinite impact. And this will also explain why we find a novelty by the mitzvah of Karban Pesach and mitzvah of Milah versus Nitabagah under the mitzvah say, which doesn't exist by other positive mitzvahs, that they have a chi of kares. Both someone who doesn't do Karban Pesach or someone who doesn't do a bris milah, this is a chi of kares. But now we understand why these two mitzvahs specifically have this extreme penalty, this extreme consequence of kares. If you're talking about something that's beyond nature, beyond the breakdown into different various levels, you can't have medium levels in the middle. It's one of the two. Either he is connected to the Eibishter, eternal bond that is beyond the changes of time, it is infinite. Otherwise, it has the totally opposite effect. He has entirely no connection. In other words, when you're talking about a regular mitzvah, so it's in the Medidah V'Agbala, it's step by step. So first you get a little bit connected and a little bit more connected. But when you're talking about an extreme mitzvah, that either it's eternal, it's permanent, it's forever, there's no limitations, there's no constraints, or there's no connection. You can't have one or the other. Al derech wie bei Klolos Yitzias Mitzrayim Kinis Kilel, es müssen herabgenommen werden, alle Medidas, echt die Medidas von Torah Kiviyachal, eben nicht bleibt man stecken in Mitzrayim, eretz von der Gilulim. Either we, just like we said about Yitzias Mitzrayim, that either we take down all the limitations, even Torah limitations have to be removed, otherwise there's no limitations removed, and you're stuck in Mitzrayim, a land filled with idolatry. So it's either or, it's all or nothing. And this is why by Karban Pesach and by Dam Mil and by Bris Milah, the mitzvah, the consequence is v'nichresa, because if you want to be able to have an infinite connection, then if you don't go there, then there's no connection at all. It's one or the other. Underfar, now he concludes, now that we understand that part of Yitzias Mitzrayim is going l'mayla me'ishtalshlus b'ha'adam, that the own person has to go out of his own boundaries, and therefore he prepares with Dam Pesach and Dam Milah, which are both mitzvahs that are bli gvul. Therefore, they're gilui from v'layla kayem yoyer by Yitzias Mitzrayim, and this is why this revelation of Layla kayem yoyer, that the night should shine like the day, By Yitzis Mitzrayim, Gedarf Taban Hashaychas Ikas and Mitzvahs Milah, it had to have a primary connection to the mitzvah of Milah, the Inyan from Velayla Kayem Yoyer, in dem Gilui Ershalamaila, because this idea that there was such a high light that came from above that illuminated the night is verbunden mit Velayla Kayem Yoyer in Aveda von Eden. It is connected. It is interconnected with the night shining like day in the Yitz Aveda. That's the Aveda von Damila, which is the Aveda of Damila. In other words, not only do I have to break the limitations of Torah in order to cause the ability of a Yetzias Mitzrayim, but I have to break the limitations of Torah with the person breaking their own limitations, going above their own limitations, and that's with Dam Milah. And therefore, Dafke, the Bris Milah had to be in the Laila Kayem Yer. That was our question at the beginning of Ezvav. Why, by the other mitzvahs, by Karban Pesach, do we find that it was considered Laila, but with regards to Bris Milah was considered Yom? Because Bris Milah is a mitzvah that takes the person L'mayla M'medidav Ha'agbala. Doesn't even discuss the whole concept that it's B'yom Hashmini, which is discussed in other sikhs. But the whole idea of Milah is that it's a Bris Olam. It's L'mayla M'medidav Ha'agbala, and therefore, as a preparation, in order to go out of Yetzias Mitzrayim, there had to be Milah, which is L'mayla M'medidav Ha'agbala, done in a Laila Kayem Yordik way, that it was done in a way that was L'mayla M'medidav of Torah, which was able to break the Medidas Vagbalas of Seder Ishtalsulus, which was able to break the Medidas Vagbalas of Teva, and it was possible for there to be a Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's incredible. Sif Ches. Alpikol Anal is Eich move on der Chilek from Mitzvahs Milah zwischen Far Matan Torah and Nach Matan Torah. This will also explain the difference in Mitzvahs Milah before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah. The Remes Inyan von Dilug in Mitzvahs Milah is Dafke in der Mitzvahs Milah from Far Matan Torah. We just explained that Mitzvahs Milah is Inyan of Dilug. It's Inyan of going outside of the person's nature, natural order, the person's own Seder Ishtalsulus to reach Inyan of Bris Olam. This idea is more applicable with Milah before Matan Torah. Was able to accomplish a jump, a transformation of even greater extremes. It took the Yidden out of the domain of the negative forces and brought them in to the domain of the holy forces. Within that, it was from the 49th gate, 49 gates of Tumah, to the revelation of the Eibishter in all of his glory. This is entirely unrelated. It's entirely unconnected. To go from Emte Shari Tumah to the Gilui of Eibishter himself, there's no connection whatsoever. So there are no restraints, constraints. There are no measurements here. There's no limitations here. You're going from one extreme to the entirely opposite extreme. And therefore, there's no difference between day and night. And that's why, api halacha, before Matan Torah, you can have a bris even at night. Mash'enki noch Matan Torah. Seinen Eden schon geworden in even the Tzir v'Seder from Kedusha. But after Matan Torah, there was already an order. There was a system, even though there was an order of Kedusha. Und der Bris, durch Mitzvahs Milah is Eichet Seder Kedusha. So the eternal bris that comes through Milah is also part of this holy Seder, this holy system. Therefore, it becomes something that is within the framework of Torah. And therefore, there's differences. Night is not allowed and day is allowed because it's already within the system of constraints. But before Matan Torah, it was totally unconstrained, and it was a dilugu kvitza from one extreme to the other extreme. In order 56, he explains, if that case, why is Milah before Matan Torah? Why is Milah Bismana have to be Bayoim? If Bris Milah If before Matan Torah we're in a place of dilug, and therefore there's no medida v'agbala v'yem v'layla. So because of that, a milah shaloi bismana could be even by night, at night. Then why a milah bismana, which is learned from Uben Shmeinas Yamim in Parshas Shlach Lecha, which is before Matan Torah, does it have to be during the daytime? So he says in order 56. Because it had to affect the world. Because it had to impact the world, and therefore it had, even though be'etzem milah is l'mayla medida v'agbala, but since it had to impact in medida v'agbala, therefore it had to follow a system of day and night. V'oid milah bizman u'meira al aveda akshura bizman al pisei devetam v'das v'inyanam harei yogilu imei ha'arla v'hester v'lachein rak b'yom. The fact that it's on the 8th day, the fact that you're doing it in a specific time, shows that there is some sort of seder. The whole of it was that there's no seder. That before Matan Torah was l'mayla from higher than seder. But if it's a milah bismana, then that you're following some seder. It's on the 8th day, and therefore there is some sort of seder, and it has to follow. It has to be by day. But milah shalei bismana is totally no seder. You're doing it in a random time. It's not following any seder, and therefore it could be done at any time because it's in the level of diluk. See if test it out. Therefore, the lesson that we could learn by Veda V'Peil. The Veda V'Yitzis time is Achvaranu Muzayim B'Chol Der V'Der B'Chol Yom V'Yom. The Veda V'Yitzis time is in every generation and every day. From Yeder Madregi is B'chinas Mitzarim, Mitzrayim, Miloshim, Mitzarim, Magulim. Every level that you're in is a limitation. L'Gabi Madregi Shalom Alam, with regards to the higher level. If B'Shas Manavarez came from Mitzrayim, when your person has to go out of Mitzrayim, he has to go out of his current state to elevate himself into a higher level. Darf men wissen, as ein dit verander bei kein Shum Medidus V'Agbalas. You have to know that in order to go out of your limitations, there cannot be any constraints. Afilu nit di medidus von Teirus afilu nit di medidos von Teirus kiviyachal, not even limitations of Teirus. Derech wissen mavur in Tanya, similar to what it explains in Tanya. Shas is retzach they're going to sein chas shalom beginnes goes with Mitzrayim if not Elyon. If a person chas v'shalom is transgressing the Eiratz Elyon, which means he's in Mitzrayim, he's transgressing the Eibusher's will. He's done talking chilik between kalos shebekalos and chamuris shebechamuris. There's no difference between what we might consider to be a less severe mitzvah and a more severe mitzvah. But a mitzvah the Ratzon Elyon was his hecher von tam vadas, a feeling von tam vadas shalamayla, then alle mitzvahs gleich. On the level of the Eibusher's Ratzon, the Eibusher's desire, which is will, which is higher than the intellect of the Eibusher, then all mitzvahs are the same. In other words, when you're talking about the understanding of the specific mitzvah, this mitzvah has this accomplishment, this mitzvah accomplishes something else, and therefore each one has a value. But when you're going to the Ratzon, I want this, Hashem says He wants this mitzvah to be done, every mitzvah is equal. They all have a Ratzon. And this is what draws out from the person who's on a low level, that even he should risk his life, should sacrifice his life. I feel if addicted to from even on a very small detail that is midrabanan, without making any reckonings, any reasonings, is ready to be made nefesh. Because when it comes to going higher to the next level, you can't start measuring. You have to go higher than the limitations, even higher than the limitations of Torah. According to Torah, there's a mitzvah that's a chiyuv misa. There's a mitzvah that's a chiyuv, that's a lav. Obviously, a chiyuv misa is more stringent than a chiyuv lav. But when you want to go to your next level, you can't start measuring mitzvahs against each other because you have to go l'mayla medida v'agbala. And for sure, you can't measure night and day. You can't measure. You can't say it's a difference if by the person it's light or if he's experienced darkness. It doesn't affect him. The fact that he's tired. That he has various different temptations and desires. He takes out with a strength, with a supernatural strength. He withdraws his sword and he circumcises himself immediately. What does it mean he circumcises himself? It means he binds himself with the Eibishter by fulfilling the Eibishter's ratzon. with a fundamental bond and an eternal bond with the Eibishter, and that's how he overcomes everything. When a person is trying to grow and he feels temptations, he feels desires, he feels like he's sluggish or tired or not interested. So rather than start making cheshbonus, what he does is he rises above the cheshbonus, and he says, and he uses the gvura of his cherev, and he says, doesn't matter what it takes, I'm going to do what it takes to connect to the Eibishter, and that's how he goes to the next level, and weiter and weiter, and that's the Yetzias Mitzrayim that a person experiences every day. So we started out asking the question, why didn't the Eibishter make the Yidden should be mal themselves koydem chashecha? And the answer is that davke, that night the bris had to be davke at night, because it had to be in a state of laila kayem yoyer, in a place where the medidis v'agbalas of teva don't exist, and it had to be where the medidis of Torah don't exist, and therefore according to Torah the bris has to be bayom. And therefore Hashem made it in a way that the bris should be at night to rise above the medidis of Torah, which is able to break the medidis v'agbalas of Seder HaYishtalshlus, which is able to break the medidis v'agbalas of Teva, so that it could be a Yetzias Mitzrayim in a manner of Dilug Ukvitza. And of course, the lesson that we take from this is we too in our own lives, we have to rise above our challenges, so that way we don't make any cheshbonus when Moshe Nefesh for the Eibishter's Ratzon, and this takes us out of our own Mitzrayim, our own Mitzrayim Magbulim, our own limitations, and brings us connects us to the Eibishter on a level of Bris Elam, on a level of an eternal connection.